Okay, so let's look generally at defence systems, policies and risk. So this is a core part of how we use data. For one, we need to protect the data, and for the other, we need to use data to make sure that we defend our systems. Okay, so we'll look at a basic model of data, information, knowledge and wisdom, and then we'll try to understand how we might use data within a security and forensic computing environment. Then an important aspect of this is understanding the risks, costs and benefits, and we'll look at the basic kill chain model that's often used for defence, understanding adversarial attacks, and then some key techniques such as defence mechanisms and defence in depth. Okay, so this is the diagram that's often shown in terms of how we have different levels of information, or how we convert our data through information, then onto knowledge, and then onto wisdom at the top. So it's important that we understand the foundation that we need to create to be able to build up the information, knowledge and wisdom that we acquire for our systems. Okay, so inside our network infrastructure, we typically have some sort of security policy and also probably some sort of auditing policy there. To make sure that we are implementing our policy correctly, then we will set up event detection systems and also network sensors around the network to be able to pick up events as they happen. So these events can then go into logs, and these can then be aggregated into our infrastructure for some sort of investigation. So we often define this as a CPAR process: collection, preservation, analysis and reporting. We need to collect our logs, we need to preserve them in some way, and then we need tools to be able to analyse them, and then finally we need some sort of reporting on these things. So often we have to gather logs across our network infrastructure, and those are often bounded by an organisational perimeter. We may also want for our threat intelligence to be able to looking at the threats outside our perimeter, but most of the time we're looking at the things that happen inside our own perimeters. And it's important that we make sure that we have the required information, so when we investigate an incident, then we have the data ready to be able to prove something or not. So within an investigation, we might be investigating an intrusion, and that might involve what's called incident response. So we detect that an intrusion might have happened on our network infrastructure, and then we will then move into an incident response mode where we can then investigate that. That may then lead to a criminal investigation, and we need to make sure that we have the correct processes in place and also the data to be able to provide the criminal prosecution with enough evidence. But it might also be that there's been a breach of the security policy on our own network, and we might have to take a disciplinary procedure against someone inside the organisation. So it's important that we understand whenever we have an incident that we plan through the stages that are involved and make sure each stage is done properly. And then there are two important things from a legal point of view, and that's due care and due diligence. So with due care, we make sure that our organisation has taken all the correct steps in the creation and implementation of our security policy and within some form of risk analysis. The due diligence is then the bit that happens after that to make sure that everything is actually working okay. So we can take due care to be able to create our security policies and our risk analysis, but it's really the implementation and the running of it relates to the due diligence part. So it's important that these two elements are intertwined and that we take due care for the policy and the risk analysis, but we also take due care in the way that we implement our policies. So why is it that we would want to implement a security policy on the network, and why should we collect data and make sure that we keep our infrastructure and our people secure? Well, one thing is obviously to reduce impact of a cybersecurity threat, and also to reduce the harm. So this taxonomy here defines that there are 5 basic harms that can be classified within a cybersecurity incident. Physical or digital harm, economic harm, psychological harm, reputational harm, and social and societal harm. So for these, there are various classifications of the threats themselves for the impacts. And we can see for something like digital harm, we might have the threat of something being destroyed, infected, causing pain, the loss of life even. So if it was a hospital system and a cyber attack took down the power, electrical power supply for the hospital, it could cause a loss of life, mistreatment, and so on. In terms of economic impact, it's often quite difficult to understand how an impact of a cybersecurity threat could impact a company economically. But we will often model in terms of reduced customers. So it could do harm in terms of customers not trusting our brands or our company anymore, reduced profits, reduced share price, loss of finances, regulatory fines through GDPR, and so on. We might also have extortion payments, loss of jobs, reduced investments, theft of finances, and so on. So there are many economic harms that can come from a cybersecurity incident, and we need to understand each of these and make sure that we either get insurance to be able to cover for this, or that we set up our cybersecurity defences to be able to try and mitigate or defend against these threats. Then when it comes to psychological, this might relate to the harm that our employees are under. So a cybersecurity attack may cause confusion for our employees, frustration, worry and anxiety, feeling upset, depressed, embarrassed, shameful, and so on. So this can be a hidden cost to the organisation, and obviously when there's been a data breach, it can be quite difficult for the employees and any people associated with a company. So although we might not see a direct financial impact, it may be later on that we might lose staff or they might become demotivated. Then an important area is reputational, and obviously this relates to things like a damaged public perception, a reduced corporate goodwill, damaged relationship with customers, and loss of key staff. So there are many things that will harm our brand, and for many companies the brand awareness and the reputation is so important for them. So a data breach or any problems from a cybersecurity point of view may lead to reduced may lead to a reputational impact. And then there is also societal impacts that may result. disruption to daily activities, negative impact on the country, generally a drop in internal organisational morale, and so on. So it's important when we analyse our cybersecurity threats that we really look at each of these in detail and try and understand what effect it will have on our organisation. So what we often do is we often look at risks, costs and benefits. And with that, we will often look at the probability of something happening, and then we will look at the cost to mitigate against it. So something that is a high likelihood and has a low cost, such as, say in some countries in the world, a lightning strike is very common. So we might go for a low cost optical fibre connection for our network so that lightning surges don't spread. So that would be low cost and highly likely in those circumstances. So anything within inside this region is likely to be worth the cost because it is a highly likely thing to happen. Things like static on network equipment. So if we have static picked up through carpets, then if someone touches a piece of electrical equipment, it might be that the static can damage the electronics within inside the systems. So to set up some sort of filter to make sure that that static doesn't get through to equipment, it's a very low cost investment, but it could cause severe costs. Anything that is low likelihood and also low cost might be worth mitigating against. Even though it's a low likelihood, then if it's not going to cost so much, then it might be worth it. Anything that's highly likely and with a high cost, such as a power failure on the network, then it might be costly to create UPS power supplies and battery backups and so on, and also have off-site backups. But the chance is quite high, especially in certain regions of the world. So it's probably worth it here to mitigate against this risk. Anything in here might not be justifiable because it could be a very low likelihood of something happening, but it has a very high cost. So in here we probably look to insurance or just taking a risk for our business. So often what we do is that we will look at what's called the annual loss expectancy, and then that's got to do with the asset value and also the probability of the event within a given year. Okay, so there are lots of different probabilities of things happening, and we need to understand the severity of each of these risks. But for something like a fire, we might go from a minor fire to an explosion. You can see here the minor fire could be quite probable inside our organisation, but something like an explosion or a catastrophe, then that's highly unlikely. So it's probable that we will try to make mitigation against a minor or a major fire, such as fitting fire suppressants and so on. But when it comes to an explosion, it might be difficult to be able to mitigate against that. For forced entry, burglary, it really depends on the neighbourhood that we're in. It could be a disgruntled employee, quite likely there. And when it comes to terrorism, it's probably quite unlikely that we would be affected by that. Okay, so each area in this case has their own probabilities, and we'll look at a sliding scale and try to understand how probable. It could be that an insurance company will give us some idea about how probable these events actually are, or over time we could build up our own risk register and understand how probable these things have been. Okay, one ontology which tries to crystallize this in terms of syntax is the CORAS Ontology. With this, a threat may reduce an asset value of an asset in a target of interest in a certain context. So in this way we can actually start to crisply define what it is we mean by risks and vulnerabilities and assets and likelihoods and so on. A threat may exploit a vulnerability which opens for a risk which contains a likelihood of an unwanted incident. And in this way, technical teams and business-focused teams can actually articulate risk, vulnerabilities, costs, and so on in a shared way. The CORAS risk management system defines this, that we will establish a context for the risk, identify it clearly, then we will analyse all the different scenarios with it, we might communicate and consult, and then we'll look at the frequency of it, the level of risk involved, and then eventually we will evaluate the risk. So as the risks happen, we'll define whether we accept it or not, and then we will go around and we will continually try to assess our risks, evaluate them, and so on. We might change the frequencies and the consequences and the level of risks as we go through within our organisation, but generally it's a feedback loop. We're learning all the time to cope with risk. When it does happen, then we obviously need to treat the risk if we're not willing to accept it. So it may be a major incident on our network, and we need to follow through to be able to treat that incident, and then again we learn from that, and we should feed that in again to our risk management infrastructure. One of the models which is defined for an intrusion or an attack on our system is what's called the Lockheed Martin kill chain model. So this is one simple incident taxonomy that we might have. This allows us to articulate an incident as it would happen. So a threat is achieved by attack tools for a vulnerability with certain access, and it will which results in something for given objectives. If we think about it, really the adversary or the intruder starts here and has certain objectives, and then we'll go through each element here. So a threat might be a hacker or a spy or a terrorist and so on. We need to understand our threat actors to be able, and their objectives, to be able to understand the budgets that they might have, or the targets that they will go for, and generally the tools that they might have. Then we look at the attack tools that could be achieved, such as user command scripting, autonomous agents, toolkits, and so on, or even a data tap. And then with these attack tools, we need to understand the vulnerabilities that we might have within our organisation that could be breached. This might be an implementation, a poorly patched system, a design architectural vulnerability, or even a configuration vulnerability. Then they might get access, and we need to look at whether it's files they can access, the data in transit, objects, or even invocations in transit, such as messages and so on. Then there'll be a certain result, and that might be a data breach or a disclosure of information, a theft of service, denial of service, and so on. And then eventually there is some achievement of objectives. Typically this might be a financial gain, but it might also be a challenge, political gain, financial gain, damage and destruction of an enemy. So this is the kill chain model here, and what we find is that the the actual processes involved will involve some form of reconnaissance. That could be internal or external to the organisation. Based on that reconnaissance, then an intruder might look to weaponize, to be able to find the correct weapon to attack an organisation. Then with that weapon, there needs to be a delivery mechanism, so that might involve a spear phishing campaign, which will then deliver the weapon. There's some form of exploitation where we can trigger, where an intruder will trigger the payload to happen. So that might be from a command and control, or it could be time-based and so on. Then there's an installation of a backdoor onto the network infrastructure, onto hosts, and possibly with some form of command and control, some dial back to a command and control to be able to achieve objectives and then to be able to act on an objective. A slightly different approach is the unified kill chain phases, and with this we have 3 main phases here. There's the initial foothold onto the system, and that includes all of the reconnaissance, weaponization, delivery, social engineering, exploitation, and also the command and control. So that gives an intruder a foothold onto the network. So it might just be for one host, and then that host is then compromised. From there may be some network propagation, a discovery of the internal network, a privilege escalation, credential access, and what's called a lateral movement to move across the network from host to host. And then eventually we have an action on objectives, and that's to look at collection, exfiltration, target manipulation, and the achievement of certain objectives. So this model here then expands this out into 18 different phases, which are fairly typical for an intrusion, but it might be that that this intrusion doesn't include some of these stages, but this is very typical. And what we want to do at an early stage is to be able to discover something and then stop it from happening, so it doesn't get to the later stages. And inside our network infrastructure, we want to make sure that at each of these stages, then we can actually create detectors on the infrastructure to be able to detect and hopefully stop. So in this case, we might look at login systems and seeing when there's bad logins and so on. At this point here, we might be looking at network connections back to malicious sites. Over here, we might be looking at someone doing a very basic ping or a network discovery on the network. So this fits in quite well, and various types of models have been created, and we can see here they kind of fit in to the overall unified kill chain model. The cyber kill chain model we can see here is only looking at these stages, where really we probably need a fuller one that will go through each of the stages that are possible. Okay, so let's look at some defense mechanisms that we would set up on our network infrastructure. So we would generally define a policy, and that policy aims to deter an intruder, an insider or an outsider. It will log events, detect when things are happening. It will try to protect our network infrastructure, also define how we react and possibly how we recover and how we can audit and verify. So each of these possibly goes into our policy definition, along with our moral, legal and social responsibilities, and whether something is really technically feasible or not. So it doesn't do any good to be able to set up in our policy some sort of deterrent that we can't actually implement on our system or is too costly. That then goes in to our whole infrastructure, and then from that we should be able to define all of our rules and rights across the whole of the network infrastructure. We then evaluate and we audit and verify, and really the whole thing should go around in a loop. We might refine our policy, implement new sets of implementation. We then evaluate how well that's working and so on. Okay, so what we try to do is to be able to create an overall secure infrastructure. So that means that we integrate CIA, confidential integrity and assurance, across the whole of the network infrastructure for the devices, the applications, the services and the communication protocols, to make sure that they're all integrated. We might also define this as AAA, that's authentication, authorization and accounting. But all of our infrastructure is secure. So if an application is talking to a service, we make sure that it's completely integrated. A problem often happens in the integration between these different layers, between the network infrastructure and the communication protocols and the services and so on. So we need to make sure that we glue the whole infrastructure together and make sure that it's all safe. Our adversary themselves, well, they could have various levels of budgets. So a home user might have a budget of just thousands. A professional data miner will have possibly a larger budget to be able to capture data. Industrial espionage, the stealing of IP, might have an even larger budget. And then general government activities will have considerable budgets if they need. And then obviously the largest budget would relate to homeland security, military type budgets. So you can see it becomes more and more difficult to defend against these adversaries as they move up and the budgets become larger. One method that's proposed for improved defence is what's called defence in depth. With this, even if we have the best of defences, it's typically possible that an intruder can breach those defences and get access to assets, data, systems, or even our users. So what we often do is to be able to create what's called the defence in depth. Our first level defence is typically a fairly low level defence because everyone will face this level of defence, and we need to make sure there isn't a delay or poor performance created as we go through this defence. So this is typically a firewall, an external perimeter firewall that is fairly lightweight, but it will stop at least low-level attacks. As we go through, we get heavier defences, and so this may be in terms of requiring passwords or certain credentials to get into the next level. And then again we go for a stronger defense, and then finally we'll have a ultimate defense here. So this might involve encryption of the data, but at each level we get tougher and we get a different type of defense at each level. So it doesn't do any good to really have the same defense again and again and again, because if an intruder knows to get over it, then it will be easy to be able to breach each level. What it should do is slow the intruder down, and hopefully we have time to be able to detect as an intruder will go through each of the phases and where it's difficult for them to get to the end goal. So what we often do is to create what's called intrusion detection systems, and in that we create an IDS, an intrusion detection system, at each of the layers of our defence. So it's in here that if intruder gets through a certain level of defence, then the intrusion detection system will hopefully pick up that intruder is in this part of the defence, and then we can do something to make sure that we can stop the intruder getting to the next level. Okay, so in terms of threats, we see many threats: data stealing and external hack, denial of service, personal abuse, worms and viruses, fraud, and so on. So what must happen is that we need to make sure our main firewall, our main gateway, will try to stop most of these, but what we want to be able to do is to make sure that our users can get out of our perimeter from there. So the firewall itself is the most basic of defences and really tries to stop the intrusion before it gets into the organisational network. Okay, so this shows a very simple architecture with a firewall here. And with this, we have three network connections. We have a public here, we have what's called the DMZ here, and then we have a private here. So the public network is untrusted. So none of the traffic on that network can be trusted at all. This here is partially trusted, and this here is fully trusted. And this private network here is typically behind what's called a NAT device, or network address translation, and the addresses here are often private addresses and cannot be directly accessible from a public space. But the other way around, from the private space into the public, the NAT device maps from private addresses onto a public address space. In this case, we're implementing defense in depth because we have a bastion firewall, we have a firewall here, we put our services over there, we have a NAT device, we have an IDS, and so on. So we're applying defense at each level. We might even, in terms of connecting to a switch, to be able to differentiate between different networks here, so that that computer cannot directly communicate with that one because it's on what's called a different VLAN. Okay, so in this case there are many different systems here to be able to protect, and we have IDS systems around. We have network-based ones on the network, listen to network traffic, but we also install our intrusion detection systems on the hosts. Okay, and often what we do is we look at this, our network communications in terms of a layered approach. We have physical data link is Ethernet, network is IP typically, transport is TCP, UDP, and so on. We have application protocols such as HTTP, and then eventually we have our data. So the data itself is segmented up into what's called typically TCP segments. Each one is marked with a sequence number, and so they can be rebuilt at the other end. For a security infrastructure, we look at the data link layer, setting up what are called VLANs to be able to segment our data at this layer. We also, at the network layer, look at firewalls, network address translation, what's called interior routing protocols, and so on. And then at the transport layer, we have what's called SSL integration, proxy servers, and so on. And then at the application layer, we can protect the protocols such as HTTP and Telnet and FTP with their secure versions, which will tunnel them. But ultimately, if we want to keep security, then we will encrypt our data at source. So we might use public key encryption for that, RSA elliptic curve. We might use symmetric key encryption, such as DES, 3DES, IDEA, and AES for that. And to create integrity, we will use hashing methods such as MD5 and SHA. Okay, so an important thing here is that we need to make sure that we keep physical security too, to make sure that all of our equipment is locked, there is security on our cables, and we have padlocks and systems and so on. Okay, so that's been an introduction to defence systems, policies and risks.